I had a bit of a confrontation today with a local school board candidate. It was election day in our town, and there's not much on the ballot because it's a mid-season election, but there is a hot button or a sort of hot topic school board race. Maybe all school board races are hot button right now because one of the candidates supports transing kids and having trans ideology taught to children in the classroom, and the other candidate does not. So oftentimes in our town, outside of the polling place, the candidates stand outside and greet voters and introduce themselves to voters. It's a fairly awkward setup, but I also kind of appreciate it because this is not the first year that I've stopped and talked to the candidates who were hoping to get my vote. This year I knew exactly who the candidates were and what they stood for, and I had mentioned to my husband that if this woman, who I'm just gonna call her the groomer candidate, if the groomer candidate was outside, that I was just gonna ask her a couple of pointed questions. So I'm carrying my 2-year-old daughter. We walk into the polling place or right outside of it. And sure enough, even though it's raining, she's standing outside. And, they always make this kind of awkward eye contact with you when you're walking up because they want you to stop and talk to them, but they're not quite bold enough to actually interrupt you walking in. So I just made eye contact back with her because I wanted to talk to her. And she was like, hey, thanks for coming today. So I walked up to her and I was like, yeah, my pleasure. I'm Liz. Are you running for a position today? I knew who she was, but I wanted her to introduce herself. So she introduced herself and I said she was running for school board. And I said, okay, why are you running for school board? And she said, well, I want to support all kids here. I want to make sure that our school system is a good place for all children. And super vague nonsense, right? Obviously just a talking point that if she has a consultant, sometimes school board members do, sometimes it's too local. Obviously a consultant structured type of vague answer. And I was like, oh, okay, question for you. Do you support biological males playing on female sports teams? And she looked a little bit taken back. She was like, biological males, so you mean transgender? And then you could tell she kind of caught herself because she didn't mean to say biological male and transgender in the same sentence. She goes, oh, well, I support students playing on the sports team that corresponds with their gender identity. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And I said, well, you said that you were running for school board to represent children in your district, but a new Gallup poll came out this week, that said that 69% of Americans, including a plurality of Democrats, do not want transgender athletes to play on female sports teams. They want transgender athletes to play on the sports team that corresponds with their biological sex. So if you're here to represent people, but the majority of people disagree with you, who are you representing? And she goes, well, I want to represent these kids. She kind of takes a couple of steps back from me, puts her hands in her pockets, her eyes dilate a little bit. And she goes, well, you're being a little argumentative. And I was like, I pointed to my daughter, my 2-year-old daughter. She's this tiny little girl. And I'm like, do you think that my daughter should be taught in a classroom that she can be a boy if she wants to be a boy? And she goes, well, kind of stutters. And then goes, well, I think if she thinks that, if that's what she believes, then I think that we should, be supportive of that. And it was honestly, it was one of those moments that was kind of obvious to everyone around that her position was ridiculous, right? That her position was just totally bananas, completely bananas. And I was like, how many genders do you think that there are? And she goes, well, it genders on a spectrum. I'm like, sure, but how many though? How many? And she said, well, there's any number depending on how people identify. And I was like, well, what's the basis of that? If there's no biological markers for that, no DNA markers for that, what's the basis of it? And she's like, well, the basis is if they feel a certain way. And I was like, so it's not based on science. If it's not based on science, is your stance based on ideology? And she goes, well, it's not science. And I was like, I know it's not science, but is your stance based on ideology? And she goes, no, it's not ideology. I was like, then what is it? What is it? So she circles back to the poll that I had mentioned. She goes, by the way, there are other polls that show that people support this. And I was just like, oh, what polls? And she goes, well, I'd have to go get them. And I'm like, okay, get them. And of course she didn't. So then she tells me again that I'm being argumentative. And I was saying to my husband after we walked out of there, I was like, well, yes, I suppose technically it was argumentative. I don't think it was confrontational per se, but yes, it was argumentative, but of course it's argumentative. This is about right and wrong. This is about morality and reality in our society as it's being indoctrinated to our children. Of course it is, it begets an argument. You think the Continental Congress in 1775, when they were debating independence, you think they weren't having arguments? Of course it was argumentative, but, to her, that is how she vilified me and demonized me. Of course, we will not be sending our child to that school district. Obviously, that was never a question. But the funny thing that she did say to me is in the middle of this, to try to end the conversation, she said, I don't think I'm the candidate for you. I don't think I'm the candidate for you. And I said, well, yes, but I think that you're going to win this race, because she is, polling shows. I was like, I think you're going to win this race. So you'll be representing me even if I don't want you to. So are you going to represent people that there's 69% of people that believe that males shouldn't play on women's sports teams? And, her answer, of course, was essentially no. The funniest part of the story is I went in, I voted, I walked around the building and came back out, and she was gone. She was nowhere to be found. I said to my husband, I was like, well, kind of feel bad for the poor woman. She just thought she was going to have a normal day, but no such thing. So I thought you guys would enjoy that. I thought you would enjoy it. It's like kind of a real life trans debate that happened. It was enjoyable, I'm not going to lie, but also incredibly sad, because I'm fortunate enough, I'm going to homeschool my daughter. My husband and I are going to homeschool our daughter, and she's lucky not to be subject to that kind of indoctrination. But so many kids are. So many public school children are going to be told that they can be a boy if they want to be a boy, and that there's 127 genders, and it's really, really awful. And this is just the beginning of the trans agenda. If you actually look at what's coming next down the line, it's even more terrifying. So we're going to talk about that right now. Let's get to it. After I had this confrontation with a local school board member who probably is going to win a seat on the school board, who is going to propagate the transgender ideology in my town's schools. I mean, she actually called schools. She said, I want schools to be a, quote, safe space for transgender kids, which is terrifying. That's a euphemism for saying that you don't want parents to know if their kids are being transed. It's awful. It's every parent's worst nightmare here. But this is not even the ultimate goal. This is not the end of the transgender ideology. This is not the end of what candidates like this woman want to happen to our society. I want to show you a tweet from a person, well, their username is Ironman92Kona. And while this person may not be famous, they articulated what's coming next. This is what the tweet says. All children should get puberty blockers until they are old enough to decide for themselves. I saw this tweet today, and it really struck a nerve with me, because I thought, you know what? Based on two different things, based on this false narrative that puberty blocking pharmaceuticals are safe and reversible and have no adverse effects. It's an utter lie, by the way, but it's the lie that's being propagated by the left. You combine that with what this school board candidate said when I pointed to my 2-year-old daughter. I mean, she had pigtails and bows in her hair. She was wearing a little dress. And she essentially said, like, yeah, you should, if she wants to be a boy, then she can be a boy, and she should be taught that she can. When you combine these two things, you realize that the next step in the transgender ideology, what is going to be targeted at our kids next, is going to be this exact narrative in this tweet. It's going to be that, well, we shouldn't make assumptions about a child's so-called gender identity when they're born and when we're raising them. We should raise every child as being gender neutral until the point that we can groom them into the gender identity that suits our political agenda. They're actually going to advocate for puberty blockers, even when kids have not displayed any kind of gender disorder. Hi guys, it's Liz Wheeler. Don't forget to watch my show, The Liz Wheeler Show, every night at 7 p.m. on the First TV. You can download the free First TV app, or you can visit thefirsttv.com/Liz and start watching today.